Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the October 2022 meeting of Triangle Association of Freelancers. My name is Don Vaughn, and this evening we're going to have a little bit of a pity party. And by that, what I mean is we're going to talk about some of the negative things that have happened to us over the course of our careers. We try to stay positive here at TAF, talk about our successes, things we've sold, new markets, things like that, which is really important. But I think it's important too that we acknowledge that professional writing does have a bit of a downside sometimes, and that bad things do happen to good writers. So what I've asked our audience today is to come forward and talk a little bit about their experiences, some of the bad things that may have happened to them, how they dealt with it, and most importantly, the lessons that were learned from those experiences. And I'll start off with a couple stories of my own. I've been writing professionally since I was 19 years old. That means I've been in the trenches for 45 years, if my math is correct. And I've worked as a full-time freelance writer since 1991. And I believe over the course of my professional career, I've probably been cheated out of about $4,000 in various ways. Most of that was non-payment for articles that I wrote. Just unscrupulous publishers decided not to come forward with the money. And one market actually waited until they printed my article before telling me that they didn't pay contributors. So the one thing I realized over the course of this was that most of this was happening with startup publications, magazines that were just getting started, had limited budgets. And so the lesson that I learned from that experience was to give a magazine a few issues under its belt before you start pitching. Because when a magazine does go under, the freelance writers are the ones who are first not to get paid. The staff will get paid, the printer will get paid, and then if there's a dollar left at the end of the day, the freelance writers will get paid. But I did have two situations that happened to me. I decided, I could have gone to court for these, but I realized that the money I would have spent on attorney's fees would have been far more than what I would have recouped with the lost wages. So I didn't pursue it. But I did do, for two situations, I did do something. Both of these were startup publications in South Florida, one of which was a kind of a regional magazine. I did a profile of a cargo company, and it was only $250, but the magazine, for whatever reason, simply didn't pay me. They kept putting me off and putting me off and putting me off. And so I decided I was going to be a thorn in their side. And so every few days I would call and ask where my check was. And when they would tell me it was in the mail, I would wait a couple of days and then call and say, the check hasn't come. And so I was on them constantly. I was just a thorn in their side, to the point where the editor wrote me a check for $250 out of her personal account, not even the magazine's account, her personal account, just to get rid of me. And I took it because I was owed that money. In a similar situation, I wrote an article for a new startup crime magazine that was based in Central Florida. And it was exactly the same situation. Published, no money coming. Where's my money? Where's my money? They eventually stopped taking my phone calls. So I ended up calling the editor at his home because I wasn't going to be put off about this. And he told me that he was no longer with the magazine, that he had either quit or had been fired. And he also let me know that the publisher was getting ready to run for public office. So I reached out to the publisher and I told him that if I didn't get my money in 48 hours, I was going to go to the press and let everybody know that his starting political career was actually screwing helpless freelance writers like me. And I had a check in hand in 48 hours. So sometimes it's worth it to pursue all of this. But the big message is be cautious with startup magazines, because there's a good chance you might not get your money. Talk a little bit about editors. Most of the editors that I've dealt with over the course of my career have been absolutely fantastic. I was only one editor that I really recall that was so bad that I ended up walking away from the market. And that market was Penthouse Forum, the digest sister publication to Penthouse magazine. Back in the 90s, I wrote a lot for that market. And the editor who hired me, a woman named Susan Wendell Posner, was one of the best editors I've ever worked with in my life. Mark will attest to that. She was absolutely wonderful. And unfortunately, she decided to change careers. She ended up being an elementary school teacher, believe it or not. And one of the editors that came in after her was a woman who had edited another magazine in the family, and they moved her over to Forum. And she was just weird. She was just really odd. and was really, really just mean. And she started making accusations against me that I was falling in love with my sources, which was something I didn't really understand. And it got so bad that I realized I didn't want to write for this woman. I didn't want to work for the magazine anymore. So I stepped away. I stepped away from it and went in other directions, other writing and stuff. She lasted about 3 issues, and then she either quit or she got fired. Someone more reasonable came in. I reestablished myself with the market and continued to write for them for several years. One of the Recently, one of the most egregious things that have happened to me has been with High Times magazine. I really wanted to write for that magazine. It pays very, very well. I like writing for counterculture publications, and I had an opportunity to get in with them through a friend of mine named Craig Yo, who is a comic book artist and a publisher. And his publishing company put out a book that was a collection of vintage 50s and 60s comic book stories with a focus on drugs and marijuana. And so I thought that this book was perfect for High Times magazine. And Craig was excited too, because he really wanted the publicity. So I reached out to the magazine with the intention of writing an article about the book, of interviewing Craig and talking about the contents of the book and how it relates to High Times. And they were very interested. But what happened was, basically, they got a lot of pages in their magazine for free. Craig gave them a lot of artwork, a lot of stuff. And so they ended up just running images from the book with very little text. So I thought, at least acting as the middleman, I was owed something. So I reached out to the magazine and I asked for $250, which I thought was fair for my running back and forth and acting as Craig's liaison and all of that. Magazine wouldn't give me a penny. I worked my way from the editor all the way up to the publisher, and I got the stiff arm all the way from top to bottom, which really angered and disappointed me. And I just realized at that point that this was a magazine that really does not treat writers very well at all. And my desire to write for them went right down the toilet. And I will badmouth them to the end of my times. I did not like what happened with that. And the last story I want to tell is about a source that I had a military officer. I forget the article, but I interviewed this woman who reached out to me claiming that she had this military experience and had done this thing, which, as it turns out, she had not. She was a fraud, and everything that she told me was a lie. But she walked the walk and she talked the talk, and I really had no reason to doubt her or question her. But as it comes out, my editor found out that she has a long history of this kind of behavior. And so when my editor let me know about this, I was very upset and apologetic. She was cool about it. She says, don't worry about it. You really didn't know. We found out afterwards. But the takeaway from that experience was that you always need to do your due diligence when it comes to sources, and making sure that they are who they say they are and have done what they say they have done. And sometimes this requires asking for documentation, proof that you did do this, or proof that you are in this particular branch if you're writing for a military officer, for example. But I think that goes for all publications and all sources, in that if we reach out through, say, LinkedIn or Facebook, and someone we don't really know comes forward with what we think we need, you need to double check about that person and make sure that they really are who they are and what they say they are. So that was the big takeaway for me from that experience. So those are just 4 stories from my particular career. I'd like to turn it over to Mark next, because Mark has a couple of intriguing stories to tell as well. Marcus?
Okay, and don't forget to tell people about all the magazines you've killed.
Oh yeah, I do have a great history. If a magazine, generally speaking, if a magazine runs something by me, they're out of business within 3 weeks. That has happened with frightening frequency, including a magazine called New Look magazine that Bob Guccione had just put out. It was a photography magazine that covered really cool photographs from around the world. I got an assignment from them to cover the World Science Fiction Convention, which was in Atlanta that year, and Ray Bradbury was the guest of honor. And so I went to this convention and I took rolls and rolls and rolls and rolls of photos. What I didn't know was the magazine went out of business the weekend I was at the convention. Mark found out because he ran into an editor friend of his who told him, nope, they're dead. But Mark, being the good friend that he is, didn't tell me until after we got home because he didn't want to crush me while we were at the convention. But actually,
Yeah,
it turned out
we
okay.
were in a we were in a party for publication insiders. And when I talked to the guy from Starlog, he said, "Oh yeah, that publication went under." And Sharon was there with me, Don's sister, and we both agreed, let's not ruin the weekend for him by telling him. So we waited until afterwards, but I couldn't believe the luck, man.
Well,
That was
as it
awful.
turns out, it actually turned out to be a good thing in a weird way because all of my slides, all of my film was destroyed in processing. All of it came out with this green yellow tint that made all of them unusable. So I would have had nothing to send to the magazine anyway. So I don't know the takeaway from that. It just goes to show you that weird stuff happens to writers a lot. That was just a weird thing for me.
Well,
So
God didn't want you to write that article. That's what it is. Well, I've got a few of these things, and for the most part, my freelancing career has gone pretty smoothly. But there have been a couple of times. There was one in particular, and I think it was for veterinary practice news. And my editor gave me the name of someone who was a veterinarian to interview for this particular article. And I was like, okay, great. So I'm interviewing her, and she's very hostile to me. And she's just, being, kind of ripping me a new one here and there and that kind of thing. And I'm like, what is going on here? Later, I found out she's also a writer, and she wanted to do that piece that I was doing. And she was angry that had gotten it instead. So she was going to make it as difficult as she could for me. There was one too, I believe it was for military officer. And military officer in most magazines actually discourage you from sending the interviewee your story. And so at this particular person, I can't even remember who it was, insisted that she get to see it before I turned it in. And I was like, okay, I'm not supposed to do this, but what the heck, right? And so I gave her the story, the entire thing, not just her quotes, which is the way you're supposed to do it. And the next thing I know, I'm hearing from Molly, the editor. She says, "Mark, did you by any chance give so and so the story?" And I said, "Yeah." She says, "Well, I just got all the corrections from her, came directly to me instead of to my editor instead of to me." And I'm like, oh my God. So she said, "We'll let this slide, but don't do that anymore, okay?" So yeah, that didn't show me in a very good light. The one I think I remember the most was my very first assignment. And it- there's a sort of a backstory here. I was working at a hospital when I first met Don. And we actually met at the Star Trek fan club in West Palm Beach. And we became friends. And he was working at the Sun, I believe,
yes.
or the
Well, I was working for the National Examiner, but stringing for the Sun.
right. And so I had this big computer console with a dot matrix printer, and he had access to something like that. And so we start writing these letters back to each other, starring, like I'd write something starring him in the letter, in this fictional story in a very unflattering light. And he would do the same for me. Basically, we were just making fun of each other, and it was just a lot of fun. I still have a bunch of those. And so he calls me one day, and he's like, "You seem to enjoy writing." And I think he was working on getting me into the writing business even then. He said, because at the time I was really into building models, still am. And I was subscribed to this thing called Toy Shop magazine. And it was basically tiny little print. People would put ads in it, and you could buy toys that you couldn't. This is before the internet. So toys and models and things that you couldn't find elsewhere. And they also had various stories. And Don had heard of this outfit down in Miami that had a museum, and it was full of advertising icons. So toys related to advertising, Mr. Bubble, that kind
Probably
of
Green
stuff.
Giant.
Green Giant, anything related to advertising that had a toy associated with it. And he said, "Why don't you go down there, and or I'll go with you, and you can write an article for Toy Shop magazine about this museum." And I was, I've always been kind of an introvert, and I was just terrified at the idea. And Don said, "Don't worry, I'll help you out." So we drive to Miami, and I've got my camera with me because it's a very graphics intensive story. It's all about taking pictures of these various advertising icons. And so Don goes in to interview the guy who owns the museum. Wasn't he a lawyer or something?
I think it was in advertising, and that's why I think he owned an advertising company or a marketing
Oh,
company, and that's why
okay.
he had the collection.
And in the meantime, I went into the museum itself, which was fairly large. I was kind of surprised at how big it was, and all of the toys were on shelves, glass shelves, with lights shining down on them. And so I got my camera out, and this was, I believe, a Canon AE1 program. This is even before DSLRs, and I had this gigantic flash unit that I figured would be really great for illuminating all of these toys. And so I put the thing on the camera, and I'm taking pictures, and it's going pretty well. And then I'd been taking horizontal photos, and I wanted to take some vertical. So I turned the camera sideways, and the flash just snapped right off of it. Not entirely. It was still hanging by two wires, which was good enough to keep it going. So I'm holding it in one hand and trying to take pictures with the other. And then one of the wires broke. And I'm thinking, great, this is my first writing assignment. I'm never going to do another one. So I went in, and Don was still interviewing the fellow who owned the place. And I said, "Can I talk to you for a second?" Told him what happened. He said, "Don't worry, I've got my camera in the car. I'll go get it." So he went down, got his camera, brought it back up. We were able to finish the piece and get really good photos out of it. And I think the takeaway from that was, and I always did this afterwards, always bring two cameras if you're going out in the field to shoot an interview. And so from then on, I would always bring my SLR, and I would also bring a snapshot camera. And of course, never needed it after that, but it was something that was good to learn. So, could have been worse.
I'm a big fan of redundancy. And
Yeah.
like Mark said, if you got it doing an interview, bring two recorders, bring extra batteries,
Yes.
whatever you need, just make sure you've got it in case something breaks, because
And now your
inevitably it
phone,
will, and at the worst opportunity.
yeah. And now your phone can be a recorder and a snapshot camera. So, you're
Yep.
kind of covered now.
Does anyone else have some stories to share? Somebody must. Nothing? I want your careers. Cindy.
All right, I'll share one. So I'm a freelance writer, but I copyright for organizations. And I had an editor once. It turns out she was a very insecure individual, but she would make changes to my copy, not because there were errors or because there were factual things that needed to be changes, but because she would like words like beautiful instead of pretty. I mean, that kind of thing, And so one day I asked her if some of her changes were mandatory, and she looked at me like I had two heads. And she said, "I've never had anybody ask me that before." And I said, "Well, it just seems to me like these are kind of writing style changes." And she just wasn't very happy with me. And she kind of said yes. So I didn't enjoy working with her at all.
Editors need to be, a good editor is flexible.
Yes.
A good editor is flexible. And I mean,
Well-
sometimes, what they say, what they do is law, and sometimes
Right.
that's understandable. But a lot of time, like what she was doing to you, Cindy, was really arbitrary. It
Right.
seemed like, and
I
didn't
think-
really make your article better.
No.
No.
Or be able, and she wasn't able to explain why she did it. It was just like muscle flexing,
Yeah.
just to say.
And I think
okay,
editors also feel they need to justify their salary.
mhm,
I got to edit something. I got to change
Right.
something because that's what I do.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Did you end up not writing for them again?
It didn't last very long after that, no.
Yeah.
And actually neither did she, so.
Anyone else? All right, well, you guys have done well then, if you don't have any stories to share. I'm trying to think, Mark was talking about the source thing, and I did have a similar experience also with military officers. It was Nursing Spectrum. One of the first articles I wrote for them was a profile of the nursing office that cared for the shuttle astronauts.
Wow.
And so I interviewed the head nurse, and I interviewed a bunch of the nurses under her, and I sent the head nurse the article for a fact check only. And I get it back, and she had changed other people's quotes, not just her quotes, but other people's quotes. And it was like, and she was just really upset that she wasn't getting the lion's share of the words in the article, and basically said, I don't want you to use my information. And we said, too late, we're gonna buy. And the article ran and everything was fine. But like Mark said, you have to be very careful who you send it to for a fact check, and always make sure they understand it's for a fact check and not a rewrite, because there's a big difference between the two. I commonly send my stuff out for a fact check, but I'm very clear that that's all that it is. So yeah, I hope none of you end up with that situation as well. And I hope you all have really great editors too. So let's talk about some good news. Does anyone have any good news to share? Any sales, anything going on? Anybody?
I have a question about
Yeah.
fact checking.
Yes, sir.
How far in advance do you, how much time do you give them to get it back to you? And how far in advance of when you have to turn the article in do you do that?
I send it to them when the article is done. Minute it's done, it's off to my sources. How long I give them depends on what my deadline is, because I want to make sure that they get it back to me. If there's some changes, I need like a day in order to make those revisions and everything. But I try to give myself as much time as possible. And I will say I need to hear back from you by this particular day, if necessary. Sometimes I don't have a tight deadline, I got a lot of time, and then I'll let it go. But I have found that you often need to poke people. Sometimes they intend to get to it, but they forget about it. And you kind of I haven't heard from you yet. And so what I do is when that happens, just saying, where's my stuff? I usually say, just confirming that you got it. If you didn't get it, please let me know and I'll resend. And what that is a subliminal reminder and kind of a poke that is like, you're supposed to have this to me. And 9 times out of 10, they will immediately take care of what I need. So, but the short answer is their deadline is predicated on my deadline. And if necessary, I give them a very specific date and time that I need that information by. I don't know how others do it. Mark, is it about the same for you?
I'm sorry?
Is it about the same for you when you do send stuff out for a fact check?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah.
I do have a story, which is not so terrible as kind of funny, if you want to hear that.
Sure.
I had, and this was kind of unusual that I would get an assignment out of the blue, because usually I had to pitch assignments to military officer, but I got an assignment from Molly, the editor, and she said, we'd like you to go down to Camp Shelby in Mississippi. We've got a new head of TRADOC, which is the training arm of the Army. And he's a 3-star general. And we just want you to meet him and go around and report on the training that's going on down there. So I flew down there and met him at, 0:30 in the morning. It was crazy. And he's having breakfast at like 5 o'clock. And I usually don't get up before 9. So I was like, holy hell, this is terrible. But at any rate, so I got to ride around with the general all day, and it was kind of interesting to talk to him because he turns out to be just a regular guy who really enjoys his job and kind of lets his guard down below the scenes. And at one point, I was turned loose to go and report on this training convoy. The National Guard was training, and they have this obstacle course with various things that pop up, and it was for training for Iraq, which was still going on at the time. And so I talked to a couple of people that were actually there reporting for a TV station, and they had the camera and they had the reporter, and they asked someone if they could ride in the Humvee in this convoy that was going out. And the commander said, sure, that's fine. And I thought, what the heck? I said, can I go too? And they said, sure, no problem. So they put me in this Humvee with a twin 50 caliber machine gun up in the turret. And because I guess you've got to, you don't want objects coming in the thing, the windows have to be up. And it was in the 90s. So I was just sweating my butt off in there, very Spartan conditions. And when the 50 caliber opened up, he was shooting blanks, but incredibly loud. And I'm sitting down there and shells are landing all around me. It was like, why did I want to be a writer again? That kind of thing. And, but we got through it, and it was a very interesting experience, and I got some great photos. And so we're pulling in to the staging area once we're done. And I got out of the Humvee, and there was right next to us, there was the TV lady and the cameraman interviewing one of the soldiers that had just been in the convoy. And meanwhile, another Humvee just comes roaring in, screeches to a stop, and the turret gunner yells, "That was effing awesome." And the guy who's doing the interview goes, that was an interesting experience, though, I gotta say.
At least you didn't get shell burns.
Well, they were kind of warm hitting me, but they weren't using live ammunition. If they had been, it probably would have been worse,
Yeah. Hannah?
Yeah, I could share something. In the summers, I read Writer's Digest for their contest for self-published novels. I had COVID this summer, and I don't usually get any reviews that I have to redo. So this summer, I'm getting comments like, "Please don't tell the reader they're stupid," and "Please don't tell them they need to read books," because on one of them I remember writing, "Less TV, more reading." One of them getting comment like 10 of them out of the 30 books that I read, and I never usually have to correct anything. And I'm like, wow, I could tell I was sick and grumpy. No patience for the weak writing. So I had to go back into all of those and fix them up, make them nice. So I was very grateful that somebody caught all that before it went out to the authors. That's my whole thing.